Johnny Crawford was Disney's golden boy, an Emmy nominee at 13, the face of a television empire that minted millions. Yet he died a financially destitute Alzheimer's patient, relying on a GoFundMe page just to survive. He did not overdose. He did not squander his wealth. He was legally plundered. In 1958, Hollywood studios drafted a contract that permanently separated the boy from his money. Today, networks still broadcast his 12-year-old face to extract infinite daily profit. The corporation kept the immortal child and left the aging man to die in absolute poverty. The architecture of this financial ruin was not built under the studio lights, but within the sterile confines of corporate legal departments. The primary legal mechanism utilized was the flat fee buyout. Under the terms of a buyout contract, Crawford was paid a fixed, predetermined sum for his physical labor per episode. Once the director called for a cut and the day's shooting concluded, the financial transaction was permanently sealed. The studio did not merely purchase a performance for a specific broadcast schedule. They acquired the absolute transferable copyright to that specific capture of his identity in perpetuity. The concept of the residual, the financial bedrock of the modern acting profession, was largely non-existent or critically flawed for early television pioneers. In the contemporary entertainment industry, a contract guarantees an actor a fractional percentage of future revenue every time a television episode is broadcast, syndicated, or streamed globally. This modern infrastructure acknowledges a basic economic reality. An actor's recorded image continues to generate capital long after the physical labor of acting is finished. In 1958, this infrastructure was deliberately withheld from the talent. Television in the late 1950s was publicly treated by studio executives as an ephemeral medium, a temporary broadcast meant to be consumed once and forgotten. This public stance masked a highly calculated long-term corporate strategy. The executives were acutely aware of the impending syndication market, the highly lucrative practice of leasing bundled television episodes to local stations and international networks. They knew that a television show with over 100 episodes could be packaged into a continuously looping product. By securing actors on flat fee contracts, the studios ensured that the primary producers of the value, the actors themselves, were legally walled off from the secondary and tertiary revenue streams. Crawford was paid for the sweat he left on the set, but he was permanently alienated from the wealth generated by his own face. A critical historical pivot occurred with the Screen Actors Guild strike of 1960. Actors, recognizing the immense unshared profits being generated by television reruns, halted production to demand a structural change to their compensation. The resulting agreement forced the studios to implement a residual system, fundamentally altering the economics of television. However, this hard-won union victory contained a devastating compromise, a statutory cutoff date that left an entire generation of early television actors in a financial black hole. The agreement primarily protected and mandated residuals for work produced after the 1960 demarcation line. For television series that began production prior to this date, such as The Rifleman, which premiered in 1958, the actors were largely left to the mercy of their original predatory contracts. Crawford's foundational work, the very episodes that established the show as a cultural monolith, was legally classified in a manner that allowed the studios to bypass the new residual requirements. he was caught on the wrong side of industry history. The mathematics of syndication surrounding the Rifleman represent one of the most efficient models of corporate profit generation in broadcast history. The series ran for 168 episodes. Once the initial production costs were amortized, the series transitioned from a physical production to a pure financial asset. The syndication algorithm is brutally simple. Local stations and regional networks purchase the licensing rights to broadcast the package to fill daytime and late-night programming hours. These stations then sell local and national advertising space against the guaranteed viewership that the show attracts. The network or holding company that owns the underlying rights to the series receives the licensing fee. This cycle requires absolutely zero additional overhead from the production company. The physical sets had long been dismantled, the crew had been dismissed, and the actors had been released from their contracts, but the product remained infinitely replicable. As the decades progressed, the global expansion of this asset accelerated. The series was dubbed and subtitled Crossing Borders into West Germany, Japan, Latin America, and beyond. Mark McCain's face was broadcast across multiple continents, drawing in new audiences and opening new advertising territories. The revenue stream was exponential and continuous, a perpetual motion machine of capital accumulation. Crawford's share of this global enterprise was absolute zero. The studio executives, their holding companies, and eventually the massive media conglomerates that acquired those libraries, absorbed 100% of the gross profit generated by his recorded childhood. The flat fee he had been paid in 1958, which seemed like a respectable sum at the time, remained static. As inflation systematically eroded the purchasing power of the dollar over the ensuing 60 years, the true value of his initial compensation evaporated, leaving him with nothing to show for the foundation he helped build. This mechanism of wealth extraction is not classified as fraud or theft under the American legal system. It is defined as standard contractual compliance. The legal framework of intellectual property and employment law prioritizes the sanctity of the signed contract over the equitable distribution of generated wealth. The system does not concern itself with the morality of a multi-billion-dollar corporation profiting endlessly from a contract signed by a child's guardians half a century prior. Crawford was not robbed in a clandestine operation. He was separated from his financial future in a well-lit boardroom with the full backing of statutory law. The studio lawyers executed a flawless legal maneuver, securing the maximum possible asset value while legally insulating the corporation from any future financial obligations to the human being who provided the raw material. It is often mistakenly assumed that protective legislation, specifically the Coogan Act, safeguards child actors from this type of exploitation. The reality of the law exposes another layer of the systemic failure. The Coogan Act, established in California after child star Jackie Coogan sued his parents for squandering his earnings, was designed to prevent the immediate theft of a child's wages by their guardians. It mandates that a percentage, typically 15%, of a child actor's gross earnings be placed in a blocked trust account until they reach the age of majority. While this law prevented parents from draining the immediate paycheck, it was completely useless against corporate extraction. The Coogan Act only protected a fraction of the flat fee. It did absolutely nothing to secure intellectual property rights, future profit participation, or residual income. It forced the parents to save the pennies while legally permitting the studios to confiscate the millions. It was a localized solution to a domestic problem that completely ignored the macroeconomic exploitation occurring at the corporate level. What the American Broadcasting Company and 4-Star Television acquired were the precise years of Johnny Crawford's prepubescence, capitalizing on the specific pitch of his voice and the innocence of his youth. They monetized his growth, capturing a finite period of human development on 35mm film. Once the footage was processed and edited, the studio possessed a frozen, immortal version of him. This celluloid clone would never age, would never demand a renegotiation of terms, would never unionize, and would never require medical insurance or a pension. The corporation had successfully decoupled the profitable image of the child from the financial liabilities of the aging human being. The cruelty of this economic reality compounded with the advent of the cable television boom in the 1980s and 1990s. As hundreds of new networks launched, channels dedicated to classic television, such as AMC and TV Land, required massive volumes of cheap, reliable content to fill 24-hour programming grids. The Rifleman sitting in the corporate vaults as a sunk cost was the perfect high-yield asset. The networks paid massive licensing fees to the rights holders, and modern advertisers paid the networks to reach the audience. During this era, Johnny Crawford could sit in his own modest home, turn on his television, and watch his 12-year-old self selling modern life insurance, pharmaceuticals, and automobiles to a completely new generation of consumers. He was forced to witness his own hijacked image operating as an unpaid, highly effective corporate pitchman, knowing with absolute certainty that he was legally barred from participating in the transaction taking place on his screen. To live in a society that rigidly measures individual worth by capital accumulation, whilst being globally famous but financially disconnected from that fame, creates a highly specific type of psychological torment. It is a form of ongoing corporate gaslighting. The general public inherently assumes that omnipresence equates to wealth. When people see a face on television every day for decades, they assume the individual behind the face resides in luxury. The reality for Crawford was a working-class existence, entirely dependent on his ongoing ability to generate new income, constantly overshadowed by the unpaid billionaire digital twin that the studios had created from his youth. The system had effectively trapped him. They had taken his most valuable asset, his childhood image, and weaponized it to generate corporate dividends, leaving the actual man to navigate the harsh economic realities of adulthood with none of the capital his own face had created. The financial architecture that legally disenfranchised Johnny Crawford was only one half of the industrial trap. The other half was entirely biological. In the standard corporate sector, an employee's accumulation of age and experience generally correlates with an increase in market value, leverage, and compensation. In the highly specialized economy of the child star, this dynamic is violently inverted. Human development is not viewed as progress. It is classified as product spoilage. The studio system did not invest in Johnny Crawford, the human being. They leased a highly specific, highly perishable aesthetic window. They capitalized on the precise pitch of a pre-adolescent voice, The vulnerability in his eyes and the physical stature that allowed him to look up to his adult co-stars with convincing dependency. When biology inevitably intervened, it was treated by the network executives not as a natural maturation process, but as a fundamental breach of the unwritten aesthetic contract. Puberty is the ultimate physiological liability for a television network relying on a static family dynamic. As the 1960s progressed, the biological reality of Johnny Crawford began to aggressively undermine the narrative premise of the Rifleman. He was no longer a small, fragile boy needing the protection of his frontier father. His vocal cords thickened and dropped, his jawline hardened, and his physical frame elongated. The carefully calibrated visual ratio between the protective adult and the dependent child was fracturing. In the control rooms and executive suites of the American Broadcasting Company, Crawford was transitioning from a premium asset to a logistical problem. The writers found it increasingly difficult to construct scenarios where a capable, nearly grown young man required rescuing. The foundational formula that had generated millions of dollars was reaching its expiration date. In 1963, after 5 years and 168 episodes of relentless, grinding production, the network officially terminated the series. The cessation of a television series is a standard business procedure, but for a young man who had been institutionalized by the soundstage since the age of 12, it was a complete systemic shock. There was no transition phase, no corporate severance package, and no psychological offboarding protocol. The immense infrastructure that had dictated every hour of his existence, the handlers, the makeup artists, the directors, the studio teachers, vanished instantaneously. The telephone, which had governed his family's schedule for half a decade with daily call times and production demands, simply stopped ringing. The network did not officially fire him. They merely allowed his utility to expire. He was unceremoniously discharged from the artificial reality of the studio lot and deposited into a real world for which he had zero practical training. Crawford had been raised in a corporate vacuum, while his contemporaries were navigating the complex social hierarchies of high school, making developmental mistakes and building the foundational operating systems required for adult civilian life. Crawford was learning how to hit tape marks on the floor, how to cry on cue, and how to defer to the absolute authority of a director. He possessed a highly refined set of specialized skills that were entirely useless outside of a television camera's field of view. He was a 17-year-old veteran of an industry that no longer required his services, carrying the psychological burden of a middle-aged retiree. Furthermore, he was immediately confronted with the devastating reality of brand saturation. The very success of the Rifleman, the omnipresence that had made the network wealthy, became the primary obstacle to his future employment. In the eyes of casting directors and rival producers, Johnny Crawford did not exist as a versatile actor. He was permanently branded as Mark McCain. To cast him in a new drama or a film was to risk shattering the illusion of the new project, as audiences would inevitably see the ghost of the boy from North Fork transposed over the new character. His face was a walking copyright infringement of his own past. He was heavily typecast, trapped in a perceptual prison constructed by his own early success. The industry demands fresh inventory, and Crawford was perceived as used goods, heavily associated with a bygone era of black and white westerns, just as the culture was aggressively shifting towards the countercultural explosion of the late 1960s. Unlike the predictable, sensationalized trajectory of the modern child star, Crawford did not respond to this rejection with self-destruction. He did not provide the tabloids with the lucrative spectacle of drug addiction, public breakdowns, or criminal behavior. From a sociological standpoint, his refusal to self-destruct is what makes his eventual poverty so profoundly indicting of the system. If a former child star squanders their wealth on narcotics, the industry is provided with a convenient, moralizing scapegoat. The corporation can easily deflect the blame onto the individual's personal failings, masking the structural exploitation that preceded the collapse. Crawford denied them this alibi. He lived a fiercely clean, disciplined life, which forces a much colder analysis of why he still failed economically. Recognizing the closing window of his on-screen marketability, Crawford attempted a strategic pivot into the music industry during the final years of his television contract. He leveraged his massive television exposure to secure a recording contract, functioning on the grim understanding that he needed to extract whatever remaining capital he could from his teenage demographic before his relevance completely evaporated. He achieved genuine, quantifiable success, placing several singles on the Billboard Hot 100, including a track that reached number 8. However, this musical venture was merely another machine operating on similar extractive principles. As a teenage idol, he was entirely dependent on a fickle, rapidly maturing audience. When the musical landscape violently shifted with the arrival of the British invasion in 1964, the clean-cut, orchestrated pop of his repertoire was instantly rendered obsolete. The music industry, much like the television network, quickly identified his expiration date, reallocated their marketing budgets to newer, more relevant acts, and quietly dropped him from their rosters. Crawford spent the subsequent decades engaged in a relentless, invisible struggle to maintain financial solvency in an economy that refused to recognize his adult value. He was forced into the grueling, unglamorous periphery of the entertainment industry. He worked in professional rodeo, utilizing the equestrian skills he had learned as a prop on the set of his television show. He accepted minor episodic guest roles whenever they were offered, enduring the humiliation of reading for casting associates who had not even been born when he was carrying a network rating share. He eventually formed a 1920s-style dance orchestra, pouring his genuine passion for historical music into a legitimate working band. He was the frontman, the manager, and the primary draw, traveling to civic centers, hotels, and private events. He was a working-class musician, hustling for booking fees and managing overheads, entirely disconnected from the passive, automated wealth being generated by his childhood image. The profound indignity of this period was the absolute necessity of leveraging his own ghost just to secure a paycheck. When he booked his dance orchestra, the clients were rarely hiring Johnny Crawford, the dedicated band leader. They were hiring the novelty of Mark McCain. To supplement his income, Crawford regularly appeared at fan conventions, participating in the nostalgia circuit alongside other actors of his era who were excluded from modern royalty structures. The emotional labor required in these spaces was staggering, demanding a psychological compartmentalization that few standard professions require. He was continuously approached by fans who had aged into comfortable retirements, boasting of grandchildren and pensions, while expecting him to seamlessly manifest the wide-eyed innocence of the 1950s. Crawford had to actively suppress his adult anxieties, mortgages, declining bookings, and aging joints to perform a localized, impromptu theater of nostalgia for every passing stranger. It was a grueling emotional tax levied directly on top of his financial disenfranchisement. This is the direct downstream consequence of the flat fee buyout contract. Because the studio had legally stripped him of any residual income, he was forced to physically monetize his own memories, trading signatures for $20 bills to pay his utility bills and mortgage. He had to sit under fluorescent lights, smiling politely at fans who only wanted to speak to a 12-year-old boy who had ceased to exist half a century prior. He was a hostage to his own history, an adult man economically shackled to the phantom of a child, while the corporate entities that owned the broadcast rights to that child continued to report record quarterly profits. The relentless, exhausting hustle of the nostalgia circuit and the demanding logistics of managing a touring dance orchestra allowed Johnny Crawford to maintain a dignified, albeit precarious working-class existence for several decades. He survived by continuously trading on the margins of his former glory, a grueling marathon of physical presence and constant travel. However, this fragile economic equilibrium was entirely dependent on his sustained physical and cognitive health. In the standard corporate architecture, an employee who has dedicated their life to an industry transitions into a protected retirement, supported by pensions, accumulated equity, and the passive income generated by their lifelong contributions. For Crawford, no such safety net existed. His entire financial viability was tethered to his immediate capacity to perform. When the inevitable biological decline of old age finally arrived, it did not offer a peaceful withdrawal from public life. Instead, it triggered a catastrophic and accelerated financial collapse, exposing the ultimate brutal consequence of the flat fee buyout contract he had signed half a century prior. The mechanism of this final destruction was not a sudden scandal or a poor investment, but a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. From the age of 12, Crawford's livelihood, his identity, and his utility to the Hollywood studio system relied entirely upon his cognitive elasticity and his capacity for memory. He was required to memorize tens of thousands of lines of dialogue, precise physical blocking on complex sound stages, intricate musical arrangements, and the rigorous social protocols of interacting with adult executives and global press syndicates. His brain was a highly conditioned instrument of retention and performance. The onset of Alzheimer's disease began a slow, irreversible campaign of erasure, methodically dismantling the very memory and cognitive skills his entire career had relied upon. Long before the public revelation or his eventual institutionalization, there was a terrifying private phase of concealment. For an active performer leading a live orchestra, the initial cognitive misfires, a forgotten chord progression, a missed cue, or an inability to recall the name of a venue, were existential threats to his immediate survival. He had to expend immense amounts of compensatory energy to mask these lapses from his bandmates and clients. Terrified that a medical diagnosis would instantly terminate his only remaining source of active income, he was forced to fight a neurological war in secret, improvising around the terrifying gaps forming in his own mind while continuing to smile under the stage lights. There is a profound, almost grotesque irony in the progression of his illness. As the biological Johnny Crawford began to lose his capacity to form new memories and began to disconnect from his own historical narrative, the corporate-owned, digitized version of his childhood remained in a state of perfect, indestructible preservation. The American Broadcasting Company and its successor holding companies possessed the flawless, unaging memories of Mark McCain. Those recorded memories were continuously broadcast globally, untouched by cognitive decay, pristine in their ability to generate advertising revenue. The corporation had successfully extracted and copyrighted the most valuable portions of his memory and identity, leaving the aging human being to face the terrifying disintegration of his own mind. However, the tragedy of Crawford's Alzheimer's diagnosis was not confined to the neurological and psychological devastation. It immediately initiated a brutal collision with the American healthcare system. In the United States, Alzheimer's is not merely a terminal illness. It is a notoriously efficient engine for total financial ruin. The disease rarely causes a swift demise. Instead, it necessitates a prolonged, intensive, and escalating requirement for specialized custodial care. Patients eventually lose the ability to perform basic activities of daily living, requiring round-the-clock supervision, specialized memory care facilities, and complex medical management to prevent injury and manage the behavioral symptoms of cognitive decline. The economic demands of this level of sustained health care are astronomical, frequently bankrupting even those with substantial diversified retirement portfolios. For Johnny Crawford, this medical reality represented an insurmountable financial cliff. Because he possessed absolutely no residual income, no fractional percentage of the millions of dollars still being generated by his syndicated television series, he was forced to confront the costs of his neurological decline using only the finite, meager savings he had accumulated through his years of hustling as a band leader and convention guest. The mathematics of his situation were unforgiving. A specialized memory care facility in the United States can easily exhaust tens of thousands of dollars per month. A lifetime of savings carefully managed by a working musician can be completely liquidated by the medical industrial complex in a matter of months. Crawford was not simply fighting a losing battle against a terminal neurological disease. He was fighting a simultaneous, equally unwinnable battle against medical bankruptcy. As the disease progressed, the terrifying velocity of his financial depletion became impossible to ignore. The modest stability he had fought so fiercely to maintain throughout his adult life evaporated. The funds required to keep him safe, housed, and medically supervised far exceeded his capacity to pay. He was a globally recognized cultural icon, a man whose face was actively beaming into living rooms across the Western Hemisphere, yet he was rapidly approaching the status of a ward of the state. He was facing the very real prospect of losing his home, his specialized care, and his fundamental human dignity, not because he had been irresponsible, but because his primary wealth-generating asset, his childhood, had been legally expropriated by a corporation that held absolutely no liability for his current medical survival. The system had successfully insulated its profits from the depreciation of the human asset. This impending financial insolvency forced his remaining family into a position of agonizing desperation. They were witnessing the slow, undignified erasure of a man they loved, while simultaneously drowning under the administrative and economic weight of his care. The private crisis was reaching a critical mass, leaving them with no viable domestic solutions. The structural failure of the Hollywood contract and the unforgiving nature of the privatized healthcare system had cornered them. To ensure that Johnny Crawford did not spend his final days in neglected, state-funded squalor, his family realized they would have to take a step that would shatter the quiet dignity he had maintained for decades. They would have to breach the privacy of his neurological decline and expose his financial ruin to the very public that still viewed him as the golden boy of the 1950s. They were being forced to construct a public spectacle of his poverty just to keep him alive. The decision to launch a public crowdfunding campaign in the early months of 2019 was not a spontaneous plea for attention, nor was it a casual request for supplementary income. It was a calculated, agonizing capitulation to a biological and economic hostage situation. When Johnny Crawford's family officially published the GoFundMe page, they were not merely asking for charity. They were formally surrendering to the brutal reality that the American medical industrial complex had entirely overwhelmed the meager financial defenses of a man who had worked his entire life. The creation of this digital campaign represents the absolute nadir of his lifelong exploitation, the final, inescapable humiliation of a man who had once been the most recognizable child in the Western Hemisphere. The launch of a crowdfunding campaign underscored the severe limitations of his historic contract. Without residual income, his survival became entirely dependent on public goodwill. For Johnny Crawford, a foundational pillar of American broadcast history, to be reduced to this mechanism of survival is an indictment of the corporate apparatus that built its empire upon his uncompensated labor. The visual interface of the crowdfunding campaign itself offered a chilling juxtaposition that perfectly encapsulated the cruelty of his predicament. At the top of the web page, visitors were greeted with a photograph of Crawford in his current state, an elderly man in his 70s, his face deeply lined, his eyes clouded by the terrifying, isolating fog of advanced Alzheimer's disease. He looked fragile, disoriented, and entirely stripped of the robust, confident agency that defines adulthood. Directly beneath or adjacent to this heartbreaking documentation of human decay, organizers inevitably included archival images of him as Mark McCain. There, in stark black and white, was the radiant, grinning 12-year-old boy in his iconic cowboy hat, clutching his prop rifle, exuding a flawless, manufactured innocence. The campaign was explicitly forcing the public to reconcile these two opposing realities. In order to generate the donations necessary to keep Crawford from being evicted from his memory care facility, his family had to leverage the very intellectual property that the studios had legally stolen from him. They were forced to utilize the copyrighted ghost of his childhood to subsidize the biological collapse of his old age. They were begging the public to pay the medical bills that the American Broadcasting Company and 4-Star Television had legally insulated themselves from ever having to acknowledge. The public reaction to the campaign was a study in profound cognitive dissonance. When the news began to circulate across social media and secondary entertainment news outlets, that the beloved star of the Rifleman was facing imminent medical bankruptcy and homelessness, the collective response was one of genuine shock and visceral disbelief. The modern consumer of television has been deeply conditioned to equate ubiquitous global fame with insurmountable generational wealth. The average viewer, having watched Crawford's face on their television screens continuously for over 6 decades across various syndication networks, naturally assumed that he resided in a state of absolute, unassailable luxury. They assumed that his omnipresence generated an endless stream of residual checks. The revelation that he possessed absolutely no equity in his own televised image and that his life savings had been completely obliterated by the costs of basic neurological care shattered this illusion. The donations began to arrive, $5, $20, perhaps $100 from particularly nostalgic fans. A slow, erratic trickle of digital charity deposited into a progress bar that measured the immediate value of a human life. Yet while these working-class fans were transferring portions of their own modest paychecks to prevent an elderly actor from experiencing absolute destitution, a parallel, entirely silent financial transaction was occurring in the corporate suites of the entertainment industry. In the exact same temporal space that Johnny Crawford was relying on $20 internet donations to afford adult diapers, specialized nutrition, and the locked doors of an Alzheimer's ward, the syndication rights for the Rifleman were actively generating massive, automated advertising yields. Corporate executives, portfolio managers, and network programmers were executing licensing agreements and selling commercial airtime against Crawford's childhood image. They were continuing to extract pristine, high-margin capital from his 12-year-old face. The profound, sickening reality of this dynamic is that the studio system had effectively externalized its human liabilities. By legally separating the profits of the intellectual property from the biological maintenance of the human asset through the original flat fee buyout contract, the corporation had ensured that the public would ultimately bear the cost of Crawford's physical decay. The fans donating to the GoFundMe campaign were not just helping Johnny Crawford. They were unknowingly subsidizing the predatory business practices of the media conglomerates, paying the human maintenance costs that the studios had successfully evaded. The silence from the institutional pillars of Hollywood during this period of public humiliation was absolute and deafening. There were no press releases from the major networks offering philanthropic intervention. There was no emergency mobilization of corporate funds from the conglomerates that currently controlled the distribution rights to his catalog of work. They operated under the cold, unyielding protection of statutory law because the contracts signed in 1958 were legally binding and executed prior to the residual mandates won by subsequent labor strikes. The corporations held absolutely zero fiduciary or legal obligation to assist the man who was currently starving while generating their revenue. The corporate legal departments operated with rigorous legal efficiency. To issue a check to Johnny Crawford, to offer even a fraction of a percent of the syndication revenue out of a sense of moral obligation would be to set a dangerous legal precedent. It would constitute an admission of the fundamental inequity of the legacy contracts and potentially expose the studios to retroactive claims from hundreds of other aging actors who had been similarly disenfranchised. Therefore, the most profitable and legally sound strategy was total, uncompromising silence. They simply looked the other way, while the man whose childhood built their corporate architecture begged for his survival on the internet. This institutional abandonment also exposed the catastrophic structural limitations of the very labor unions designed to protect performers, the Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, organizations that pride themselves on defending the economic dignity of the acting profession, were structurally impotent in the face of Crawford's ruin. Union protections, pension plans, and healthcare safety nets are inherently tied to ongoing contributions, active employment, and, most crucially, residual income. Because Crawford's foundational, most culturally significant work was legally classified as buyout labor prior to the 1960 strike demarcation line, it did not feed into his union pension or healthcare qualifications in any meaningful, sustaining way. The unions are designed to protect the active worker operating under modern collective bargaining agreements. They possess severe blind spots when it comes to the casualties of the pre-residual era. Crawford fell into a jurisdictional and historical abyss. The union could not retroactively rewrite a 50-year-old contract, nor could they unilaterally confiscate corporate profits to fund his medical care. He was a pioneer who had helped build the very industry that the unions now regulated, yet he was left to die outside the gates of their protection, a casualty of the temporal boundaries of labor law. The tragedy of this jurisdictional exclusion was further exacerbated by the sheer impossibility of collective action among the victims. By the time the financial devastation of these legacy contracts became fully apparent in the modern digital age, the actors of the pre-1960 era were heavily fragmented, elderly, or deceased. There was no cohesive, energetic voting bloc left within the Guild to pressure union leadership into revisiting closed historical agreements. Crawford was fighting an institutional giant, but he was doing so as an isolated remnant of a forgotten cohort, possessing neither the legal leverage nor the collective numbers to force a renegotiation of industry standards. The media coverage surrounding the crowdfunding campaign further compounded the indignity by actively participating in the obfuscation of the underlying corporate crime. When entertainment news programs and digital tabloids reported on Crawford's declining health and financial desperation, they meticulously framed the narrative as a heartbreaking human interest story about the ravages of Alzheimer's disease. They focused extensively on the tragic nature of his memory loss, interviewing his family about the emotional toll of the illness and highlighting the loyalty of his aging fan base. What these media outlets, which are themselves subsidiaries of the same massive media conglomerates that profit from legacy contracts, deliberately omitted was the forensic economic analysis of why he was bankrupt in the first place. They refused to interrogate the anatomy of the flat fee buyout contract. They refused to ask why a man whose face was broadcast on their own networks daily was relying on public charity. By framing his poverty as a tragic, unavoidable consequence of a terrible disease, rather than the direct, calculated outcome of systemic corporate wage theft, the media effectively shielded the studio system from any public accountability. They transformed an act of corporate expropriation into a simple, apolitical tragedy. asking the audience for their tears and their donations while actively protecting the billionaires who held the syndication rights. The psychological toll this public exposure exacted upon Crawford's family is difficult to overstate. To successfully run a medical crowdfunding campaign, one must continuously feed the algorithm of public sympathy. The family was forced to regularly update the digital ledger with details of his declining condition, stripping away the privacy that is usually afforded to the dying. They had to document his loss of motor function, his inability to recognize loved ones, and the escalating costs of his palliative care. The dignity that Crawford had so fiercely protected throughout his decades of touring and working the nostalgia circuit, the quiet pride of a working-class musician who refused to succumb to the stereotypical child star meltdown, was systematically dismantled by the necessity of survival. He was reduced from an autonomous human being to a pitiable object of charity, a cautionary tale displayed on a digital billboard for public consumption. As the campaign dragged on through 2019 and into 2020, the donations accumulated just enough to keep the immediate threat of eviction at bay, creating a harrowing month-to-month existence that resembled a slow-motion execution. The funds did not provide him with a life of comfort or luxury. They merely financed his continued institutionalization in a facility capable of managing his severe neurological decay. He was existing in a state of suspended animation, biologically deteriorating, while economically tethered to the sporadic generosity of an aging demographic of television fans. While Crawford relied on crowdfunding to sustain his basic medical needs, his childhood image continued to generate passive revenue within the modern streaming ecosystem. The legal boundaries set in 1958 remained structurally intact until the end. The arrival of the year 2020 introduced a catastrophic variable into the global economic and social infrastructure, the COVID-19 pandemic. While the virus precipitated an unprecedented international health crisis and widespread financial destabilization across numerous sectors, it simultaneously created an environment of unparalleled, hyper-accelerated growth for the entertainment and media conglomerates. The implementation of global quarantine mandates, social distancing protocols, and the subsequent confinement of billions of individuals to their homes effectively created a captive audience on a scale never before witnessed in human history. With traditional avenues of out-of-home entertainment completely eradicated, domestic media consumption metrics skyrocketed. For the major studios and television networks, some holding vast archives of legacy content, the pandemic was not a logistical hindrance. It was a macroeconomic windfall. The global lockdown initiated a gold rush for streaming platforms and digital broadcast networks, completely revolutionizing the revenue yield of historical intellectual property. It was within this specific, highly lucrative corporate paradigm that the final, most egregious phase of Johnny Crawford's exploitation was executed. During times of acute societal distress and collective psychological trauma, consumer behavior in media predictably shifts toward comfort viewing, the consumption of familiar, highly structured, and morally unambiguous legacy content. The Rifleman, with its simplistic post-war rendering of American frontier justice and the reassuring static dynamic between a protective father and his innocent son, experienced a massive resurgence in viewership. The series became a high-performing asset for secondary broadcast networks, and more importantly, for the rapidly expanding sector of advertising-based video on demand, or AVOD platforms, such as Tubi, Pluto TV, and Freevee. These digital platforms, owned by multinational holding companies and tech giants like Paramount Global and Amazon, operate on a business model that perfectly capitalizes on sunk-cost legacy media. Unlike subscription services, AVOD platforms offer free content to the consumer, generating revenue entirely through hyper-targeted, unskippable digital advertising inserted seamlessly into the video stream. The migration of the Rifleman to these digital infrastructures exposed a devastating modern loophole in the already predatory 1958 flat fee buyout contract that Crawford had signed as a child. When the original legal documents were drafted, the concept of the internet, digital streaming, and algorithmic advertising did not exist. However, the corporate attorneys who drafted those initial agreements were meticulous in their utilization of absolute language. The contract ceded Johnny Crawford's image, voice, and performance rights in perpetuity across all media known and hereafter devised. This specific, legally bulletproof phrasing allowed the modern media conglomerates to transition Crawford's childhood image onto digital servers and stream his face to millions of smartphones, tablets, and smart televisions without the necessity of renegotiating his contract, securing his consent, or remitting a single cent of residual compensation. The technological delivery system had evolved from terrestrial radio waves to broadband fiber optics, but the fundamental architecture of the theft remained completely intact. Furthermore, the digital medium demanded a new, aggressive fragmentation of his image to maximize user engagement. His childhood face was extracted from the narrative context of the original episodes and transformed into dynamic thumbnails, auto-playing preview loops, and targeted banner ads designed specifically to arrest scrolling behavior. Crawford was no longer just an actor participating in a story. His digitized features were utilized as frictionless user interface elements, engineered by algorithms to trigger rapid dopamine responses in potential consumers. The corporation had weaponized his innocence not just as broadcast content, but as the exact psychological bait used to trap users within their digital ecosystem. In the digital streaming ecosystem, the commodification of Johnny Crawford reached its ultimate clinical evolution. On a standard television broadcast in the 1960s or 1970s, an advertisement was a blunt instrument, broadcast to a generalized demographic. In the 2020 AVOD streaming environment, advertising is a precision-engineered algorithmic transaction. When a viewer streams an episode of The Rifleman on a smart device, the platform simultaneously harvests specific data points regarding the user's age, location, consumer habits, and browsing history. Advertisers bid in real-time microsecond auctions to place their commercials within the episode. Thus, Crawford's 12-year-old face was no longer just selling a generic product. It was operating as high-efficiency digital bait, capturing viewer attention so that data brokers could execute highly lucrative, personalized ad injections. The boy from 1958 was now actively functioning as an unpaid digital laborer in the 21st century surveillance economy. The profit margins for the corporations distributing his image approached 100%, as the cost of digital replication and transmission is effectively zero. while the corporate executives overseeing these AVOD platforms were safely isolated in wealthy, pandemic-proof enclaves, watching their stock options surge to record highs fueled by captive lockdown audiences, the biological reality of Johnny Crawford was plummeting toward its terminal phase. The pandemic protocols that proved so lucrative for the digital media sector imposed a regime of absolute devastating isolation upon him in the physical world. Memory care facilities across the United States, recognizing the extreme vulnerability of their elderly populations to the novel coronavirus, instituted immediate and severe lockdowns. All external visitation was strictly prohibited. For a patient in the advanced degenerative stages of Alzheimer's disease, this epidemiological protocol amounted to a form of psychological torture. The management of Alzheimer's disease is heavily reliant on routine, familiar stimuli and the physical presence of loved ones to anchor the patient's rapidly dissolving connection to reality. By completely severing his access to his family, the pandemic lockdowns accelerated Crawford's cognitive decline. He was confined to a sterile clinical environment, surrounded exclusively by medical personnel in personal protective equipment, masks and face shields that obscured the human expressions necessary for nonverbal communication, further disorienting a mind that was already losing its grasp on language and recognition. He was trapped in a terrifying solitary confinement, unable to comprehend why his family had seemingly abandoned him, while his neurological architecture continued to systematically collapse. The isolation stripped away the final microscopic layers of his human dignity, leaving him entirely at the mercy of institutional care. For a patient suffering from advanced dementia, cognitive reality is heavily anchored by sensory continuity. The specific cadence of a wife's voice, the tactile reassurance of holding a familiar hand, or the scent of home. The strict epidemiological barriers of glass windows, heavily filtered ventilation systems, and layers of synthetic gowns effectively sterilized his environment of these crucial biological tethers. Deprived of the neurological grounding that only intimate human contact can provide, the fragile scaffolding of his remaining consciousness had absolutely nothing left to hold on to. The quarantine protocols, while medically imperative for the facility's survival, acted as a sensory deprivation chamber that actively hastened the dissolution of his selfhood. Simultaneously, the financial burn rate of his custodial care underwent a severe escalation. The operational costs of medical facilities surged due to the implementation of COVID-19 safety measures, the procurement of scarce personal protective equipment, and the massive staffing shortages that plague the healthcare industry. These inflated overhead costs were immediately passed down to the patients. The GoFundMe campaign, which his family had desperately launched in 2019 to prevent his eviction, was rapidly losing its momentum. The socioeconomic reality of 2020 was bleak. Millions of working-class Americans, the very demographic that comprised Crawford's donor base, were facing sudden unemployment, furloughs, and their own imminent financial crises. The public's capacity for digital charity was severely depleted. The campaign funds began to evaporate at an alarming velocity against the crushing, unyielding monthly invoices of the memory care unit. The mathematical impossibility of crowdsourcing a defense against the American healthcare system became glaringly apparent. A digital tip jar cannot sustain the terminal phase of neurological decay. The disparity between Crawford's financial reality and his corporate value had reached its peak. While his physical health failed in a locked memory care ward, digital servers continuously streamed the Rifleman to a global audience, reliably generating revenue for the rights holders. To compound the tragedy, the physical fortress of the memory care facility eventually failed to protect him from the viral pathogen it had isolated him from his family to avoid. Like tens of thousands of other elderly Americans trapped in the congregant care system, Johnny Crawford contracted COVID-19. The virus invaded a host whose immune system was already fundamentally compromised by age and advanced neurological disease. He was forced to battle an aggressive novel respiratory infection while his brain was actively shutting down his body's executive functions. He survived the immediate acute phase of the viral infection, but the physiological toll it exacted upon his already fragile biological infrastructure was catastrophic. The virus acted as an accelerant, further degrading his physical strength and plunging him into the final terminal trajectory of his life. As the calendar turned from 2020 into the early months of 2021, the situation transitioned from a crisis of maintenance to the grim logistics of palliative care. The medical objective was no longer preservation or treatment. It was exclusively the management of physical pain and the facilitation of a biological shutdown. He was transitioned to hospice protocols. The once vibrant boy whose tap dancing had impressed Walt Disney, the 13-year-old actor whose emotional depth had secured an Emmy nomination, the disciplined musician who had hustled for decades across the nostalgia circuit just to survive, was now reduced to a bedridden, uncommunicative patient. His bank accounts were empty. His intellectual property had been legally plundered 6 decades prior. His memories had been eradicated by amyloid plaques. Everything of tangible and intangible value had been systematically stripped from him by a combination of corporate exploitation, statutory law, and biological disease. The media conglomerates, operating under the protection of their legacy buyout contracts, maintained their silence. They issued no financial assistance, protected by a legal architecture that owed him nothing. As Crawford entered his final weeks in hospice care, the digital platforms continued to broadcast his childhood image, successfully insulated from the financial liabilities of his decline. The absolute finality of this legal separation became starkly visible as his physical body prepared to expire. In standard models of wealth accumulation, a lifetime of labor leaves behind a residual estate, a financial legacy that can offer stability and comfort to surviving family members. For Crawford, the moment his biological function ceased, his ability to generate personal income instantly vanished, leaving his widow to navigate the emotional aftermath amidst a landscape of completely depleted resources. Yet the media conglomerate's claim over his digital avatar remained perfectly intact, ensuring that the immense wealth generated by his face would easily outlive the grieving process of the very family who had cared for him. On April 29, 2021, Johnny Crawford passed away. There was no Hollywood ending, just the quiet conclusion of a biological decline, subsidized largely by the charity of strangers. Yet, in the exact moment his heart stopped, his 12-year-old self was still riding across thousands of screens on digital streaming platforms. The network executives issued the standard prepackaged condolences for a beloved icon, deliberately omitting the economic reality that defined his final days. The industry had built its empire on his childhood, legally isolated itself from his aging reality, and left the man behind. Every rerun broadcast today remains a pristine, high-definition record of that very transaction.